Okay, everyone, let's make a start tonight, and I just want to welcome you here to the Vilaseca Memorial Lecture 2024. And the wonderful thing is we can have you in person for the first time in 5 years. We're no longer online, we're in the real world, and it's a great delight to have also Manuel de Falla, my sister and Ma, her daughter here with us. We're very honoured by their presence. This is then, the 14th lecture since Debbie's death in 2010, and Sarah will mention the history of the lecture, and she will introduce our speaker. Sarah Wright is Professor of the Department of Languages, Literature, Cultures, where sits the Centre for Visual Cultures, and I pass over to Sarah.
Thank you, James, and welcome everybody to the 2024 David Vilaseca Memorial Lecture. And it's really fantastic to see so many people here today. I'm not used to using my glasses while I speak, so you have to excuse me. This is the first time we've been back in person since COVID, so it's really exciting for us. And it's great to see members of David's family who've been able to make the journey, and we're all so welcome. So thank you so much. This David Vilaseca Memorial Lecture runs annually in tribute to our friend and colleague David Vilaseca, who died tragically and far too soon in 2010. The lecture series is a tribute to David's work as a scholar in Hispanic studies, not forgetting for one moment that he was a proud Catalan, and far beyond, and the indelible mark he made on a range of disciplines, from post-structuralist thought, particularly psychoanalysis and queer theory, and from surrealism to autobiography, just to name a couple, and from painting to film. He was also involved in lots of other areas as well, and we know that he wrote a novel, and we're about to hear about some poetry as well, I think. So he was a man of towering intellect, but he also knew how to make texts come alive in an accessible way for his undergraduate students. And he was a generous and kind PhD supervisor. We also knew him in the department and the university as a wonderful friend and colleague who will always be remembered and missed. And today I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker, Claudia Hopkins, who's Professor of Art History at Edinburgh College of Art, the University of Edinburgh. Claudia's research focuses on 19th and 20th century art and visual culture in transnational contexts. She's a leading expert of Spanish art and culture, whose work has been supported by the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities in Edinburgh, the Spanish Embassy, the Cervantes Institute, the Centro de Estudios Europa Hispánica, the Leverhulme Trust, the Carnegie Trust, and the Terra Foundation for American Art. Claudia studied art history and archaeology as an undergraduate student at the University of Montpellier and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She holds a PhD in history of art from the University of Edinburgh, and she's lectured at that institution since 2005. She also worked at other Scottish institutions, such as the Universities of St Andrews in Glasgow and the National Trust for Scotland, before obtaining a permanent position at Edinburgh in 2014. In 2020, she was seconded to Durham University, where she served as director of the Zurbarán Centre for Spanish and Latin American Art. She returned to Edinburgh in 2023 and remains affiliated to Durham as Honorary Professor of Hispanic Art. Her most recent book, Art and Identity in Spain, 1833 to 1956, The Orient Within, published by Bloomsbury in 2024, examines Spanish attitudes to Al-Andalus and Morocco over a period of 120 years, challenging over-familiar understandings of Orientalism. I can see this image behind me. Professor Hopkins is a prize-winning scholar. In 2022, her edited volume, Romantic Spain, David Roberts and Genaro Pérez Villamil, won the Mark A. Roglan Publication Award from the Custard Institute, Meadows Museum, Dallas, for her exemplary scholarship on Spanish art, and the Jonathan Brown Award from the Society of Global Iberian Art for exceptional achievement in an exhibition catalogue. Her work is marked by its dimension of outreach and international partnerships. She's often developed the public impact of her research through her involvement in curating. In 2021, she curated La España Romántica, David Roberts and Y. Genaro Pérez Villamil, a multimedia exhibition at the Real Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando in Madrid, in collaboration with the Centro de Estudios Europa Hispánica. In 2023, with Sabari Ive, she curated an exhibition of prints and drawings, Impression of Spain in the 1830s, at the Morn Library, King's College, London. Her interest in curating dates back to 2009, when she contributed to the blockbuster exhibition, The Discovery of Spain, British Artists and Collectors, Goya to Picasso, at the National Gallery of Art in Edinburgh. Claudia is a polyglot scholar with a keen interest in translation. Between 2015 and 2020, she co-led a major project on the European reception of US art in the Cold War era, funded by the Terra Foundation, and involving numerous international experts and translators. The main output is the 2-volume book, co-edited with Ian Boyd White, Hot Art, Cold War, Western and Northern European Writing on American Art, 1945 to 1990, and Southern and Eastern European Writing on American Art, 1945 to 1990, published in 2020 by Routledge. The 2 volumes have been described as groundbreaking. In 2023, she became editor of Art in Translation, and she was previously co-editor and managing editor of this journal, which is supported by Edinburgh College of Art and the Getty Foundation. So it's such a privilege for us to be able to hear you speak today, Claudia. So I give everybody Claudia Hopkins, who's going to talk about From Ethnographic to Camp Orientalism, Gabriel Morcillo Raya, 1887 to 1973.
Well, thank you so much for this very generous introduction, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here at Royal Holloway, and it's an honor to deliver this year's lecture in memory of the distinguished scholar David Vilaseca. I hope he would have approved of my topic, and I'd love to know what he would have made of the material I'm presenting today. Figures greeting us with radiant smiles are unusual in the history of art. But it's not just the smiles that stand out in this painting. The white young men are disguised as effeminate ephemes, with flowing robes, partly covering their perfectly toned bodies. Their maleness contrasts with feminizing attributes, flowers, fruit garlands, colorful bracelets, and golden earrings. Various objects are evocative of genitalia, a phallic flute, red hot peppers, round fruit, and open jars. The image is charged with an unashamedly homoerotic atmosphere that is rare in art of this time. The artist is Gabriel Morcillo Raya, or Morcillo. He was born in Granada in 1887. He's hardly known today, but he enjoyed a successful career as a painter of Orientalist scenes, as a painter of portrait and of still lifes. He was popular with collectors, and his paintings were shown at the Venice Biennale in the 20s and even in Nazi Berlin in 1942. And my interest in this artist stems from my research on Spanish attitudes to the Islamic world, which has just been published as a book. And when I was working on this book, Morcillo's work stood out. It seemed difficult to classify or categorize at first, but it turned out to be an eye-opener, as it led me to reassess my interpretation of earlier artists whose Orientalist paintings have traditionally been described as ethnographic. So in this lecture, I will explore Morcillo's career within the local and broader context. What motivated him to create such sensual images of men, and how were they received within a society characterized by homophobia and transphobia. Morcillo's imagery has roots in 19th century paintings of North African nudes or North African males in Spanish Orientalism, with the Catalan painter Mariano Fortuny serving as a prime example. Fortuny was sent to Morocco in 1860 by the Catalan government to make sketches of the Spanish-Moroccan War. But Fortuny was more interested in capturing everyday life and experimenting with color, light, and surface texture. He returned multiple times to northern Morocco, and it had a huge impact on his work. Classical and oriental homoeroticism often collide, as in this striking scene, as I'm going to argue, which was painted in his studio in Rome. We see a black and almost nude farrier who is shoeing a donkey, assisted by another man squatting opposite him, who extends his left hand to hold the donkey's hoof in position. Fortuny's scholarship conventionally discusses the painting in terms of the artist's treatment of light and his interest in capturing the customs of the country. But even if an ethnographic intent was his starting point, one cannot overlook the visual reference to classical male beauty, particularly to the ancient sculpture of the Greek discus thrower, from whom Fortuny's figure inherits a trace of eroticism. And this is not an isolated example. In the etching on the left, a prepubescent boy is shown as an exquisite nude figure in contrapposto, which evokes a lengthy art history of seductive ephebes, amors, and Ganymedes and angels from Renaissance prototypes. In the other image, Fortuny depicts a slightly older boy sitting on a plinth with a phallic classical flute, and the title also refers us to classical antiquity, the idyll by Theocritus. Set in distant realms, these images offer Fortuny's viewers a safe rationale for appreciating child nudity without necessitating a moral justification for their interests. Both depictions resonated at the time with accounts of homosexuality and pederasty in Muslim culture and in Greek antiquity. For example, a translation of a collection of Arabic and Persian poems published in 1833 praised male friendship and same-sex desire in the Muslim world. Conversely, a report written by the Spanish officer Joseph Joaquin Gatell, who infiltrated the Sultan's army in Morocco, documented the presence of sodomy in the Moroccan army and the presence of boys serving as sex slaves. So these two examples here demonstrate that Western perceptions of Muslim masculinity were less rigid than constructs of Occidental masculinity. The sensuality of Fortuny's male bodies is also relatable to the 18th century writings on classical Greek sculpture by Johann Winckelmann, the founding father of art history. As Alex Potts notes in his important study of Winckelmann, the German scholar voiced an explicit erotic enjoyment of the male nude alongside a passionate apologia for the value of male friendship and love. In analogous terms, Fortuny reveals a classical ideal in an ordinary African man in his painting. The proximity of the black farrier and the assistant evokes the idea of male friendship, perhaps. It is interesting also that Fortuny gifted one of the three versions of this painting to a close friend, inscribing a personal dedication in the area above the farrier's back. In Fortuny's later work and that of his followers, the ethnographic interest gives way to more hedonistic imagery, including of himself. In the photograph, you can see he is disguised as an Arab with a rifle, a pose that he chooses for the depiction of an Arab chief leaning seductively against a Persian rug. In the work of his follower, the civilian José Villegas y Cordero, we are dealing with either virile or effeminate semi-nude men with glistening dark skin, lounging intoxicated in fragrant interiors. In the painting on the left, there's also a female mandolin player, but she's of minimal interest. Villegas' real interest is in the body of the drug-besotted African man, as you can see in the picture on the right. In a later painting by Anthony Fabres, all we are left with is a vision of a handsome African man looking confidently out of the painting. The libidinal economy of the picture is generated by the body of the man posturing as a male Venus, a male prostitute. And as I have argued elsewhere, such iconographies emerged out of the homosocial structure of a closely knit group of Spanish artists in Rome. Male bonding occurred through a range of activities, including life drawing classes, traveling together, going on nocturnal walks in medieval towns, collecting exotic artifacts, and engaging in pranks. Their studios, which were filled with exotic objects, were important spaces for social gatherings, which often involved dressing up or participating in comical performances. There are no visual records of their gatherings, but as you can see in this photograph on the right, Fortuny and his friends liked dressing up as Arabs, and they readily adopted and performed exotic identities. The interest in depicting effeminate, exotic males in art resonated with the increasing confusion about gender and sexuality in the late 19th century. As is well known, terms like feminism and homosexuality began to be used at that time. And in Spain, the ideal model of manhood had already been challenged earlier by the unhappy marriage of the Queen to Francisco Assis, who was perceived as effeminate and impotent. In literature, the theme of the emasculated man emerges in novels, such as in Clarin's Su Único Hijo, where the male protagonist has no economic control over his life and money, and is described as a dish rack in his wife's house. In Pardo Bazan's novel, Memories of a Bachelor, in turn, we read about a narcissistic dandy figure obsessed with art and beauty, and also a cross-dresser. So Morcillo's work can be seen in relation to this fin de siècle gender anxiety, which finds expression in literature and also in Orientalist painting. However, unlike Fortuny and other Orientalist painters, Morcillo did not travel to northern Morocco, which became a protectorate of Spain in 1912. In fact, Morcillo hardly traveled anywhere. In 1907, he entered the Escuela de Artes Industriales in Granada, then went to Madrid to study with the academic painter Cecilio Pla, after which he returned to his native Granada, where he developed his career. He was made the director of the Residencia de Pintores in the Alhambra in 1922. In 1927, he began teaching at the art school in Granada, and then became its director a few years later. Morcillo's outlook was consciously local. Growing up in plain sight of the Alhambra, the palace fortress built by the Nasrids in the 13th and 14th century as a paradise of earth, this was part of Morcillo's everyday life from childhood. As a teenager, Morcillo witnessed the transformation of the Alhambra into a tourist site, and the presence of artists, travelers who painted pictures of this monument was, you would have felt this. Morcillo himself was less interested in the architecture of the Alhambra. but he embarked on a more imaginary journey into Granada's Islamic past and into the self. An important source for him was Washington Irving's book, The Tales of the Alhambra, first published in 1832 and an instant bestseller. And Morcillo's titles often refer us to historical figures derived from literary sources, Irving and others, such as the Arab poet Ben al-Jatib, who supposedly is a source for the painting of the archers here in the center. On the right, the title refers us to the legend of Ahmed, the Pilgrim of Love. It's a story that explores the theme of sexual repression. In a nutshell, Ahmed is a prince raised in isolation within a tower in the Alhambra to shield him from romantic love until he reaches adulthood. His only friends who empathize with his solitary suffering are the birds who come to visit him in his tower and tell him that love and passion are important parts of life. So going against the will of his teacher, Ahmed resolves to search for love. He escapes from his tower, travels to Toledo, where he wins the affection of a Christian princess and returns with her to Granada, where he becomes king. So the tale concludes with Ahmed's triumph over solitude and repression, a topic clearly that appealed to Morcillo. So Morcillo imagines Ahmed sitting in an enclosed space with a bird, as in the story. However, this is not a traditional academic picture seeking to convey a scene with utmost historical accuracy. Ahmed's stance is somewhat stilted, this bird stiffly placed on his arm, and he's not sad, as in the story. He's smiling, holding a pose. In fact, the artificial impression of Morcillo's picture is reminiscent of the staged photographs of tourists by Rafael Garzón, whose studio was located in the Alhambra complex. Garzón's business traded in cultural cross-dressing by offering tourists the possibility to examine themselves, to imagine themselves as Arabs before or after visiting the Alhambra. In his studio, they could dress as Arabs and choose exotic props to their liking, depending on what kind of Arabs they wanted to be. While Garzón's and Morcillo's practices had different aims, they were both enabling temporary identity switching underpinned by a sense of playfulness in which the models and the artist or photographer collaborated. Morcillo differs from Garzón in that he's not dealing in trivial cultural cross-dressing in return for quick earnings. His undertaking was a serious practice of painting, which often challenged accepted norms of gender and sexuality. And this is clear in his overtly homoerotic, multi-figured pictures. In painting after painting, he presents variations of semi-nude men in Arab disguise, often smiling or swooning, ecstatic faces, sometimes with serious and moody expressions, always surrounded by exotic objects. And they are painted from stage scenes with local models of young men from Granada who are easily recognizable from one picture to the next, and some became close friends of the artists. Here, two men sit closely together, their bare torsos, arms, and shoulders touch. Both are wearing feminizing large earrings. The one on the left, in the foreground, looks out at us, looking out knowingly, his lips parted in a smile, as if sharing a secret with the viewer. Because their bodies are covered from the waist down, the precise nature of their exchange is left to our imagination. The title, Dos Moros, or Two Moors, moves the homoerotic scene into medieval Granada, thus providing a safety net for the early 20th century viewer of the painting. Morcillo's title does not refer to a particular legend told by Irving, but its homoerotic undertones resonate with references to same-sex love in a collection of Arab Andalusian poetry, which was translated at the time by a scholar in Granada, Emilio Garcia Gomez. So this translation, which was scandalous at the time, gave new impetus to the associations between Muslims' culture, homosexuality, and effeminate masculinity, all these things that had already been circulated in Spanish writing since the early modern period. It also impacted on others, such as Morcillo's friend, Lorca, especially on his Divan del Tamarit, which is a collection of poems composed in honor of the old Arab poets of Granada. According to Andrew Anderson, Lorca was interested in the idea that Arabic culture has a, and I quote, greater sexual tolerance, which resulted in the atmosphere of indulgent carnal sensuality, often to be found in Arabic verse, wherein heterosexual and homosexual love are viewed and treated on entirely the same footing. Lorca's poem was more erotic than anything he had done before, even though it is not open about homosexuality. So for Lorca and Morcillo, Arabic poetry and Granada's Islamic heritage in general gave access to an authentic utopia of sensuality. Returning to Morcillo's Moors, the theatrical nature of the scene can be interpreted by means of the notion of camp, as defined in Susan Sontag's famous Notes on Camp. Campiness is, says Sontag, the love of the exaggerated, the off things, the things being what they are not. Camp is everything in quotation marks. In this case, Moors are in quotation marks, meaning the notion of effeminate Muslims. As Sontag says, to perceive camp in objects and persons is to understand being as playing a role. It is all too obvious that these Moors are not figures from medieval Granada, but real, erotically engaged young Spanish men. Their suggestive smiles are a giveaway, leaving the viewer with a conundrum of having to decide about how to respond to the conceit that Morcillo has staged. Camp, as Sontag puts it, neutralizes moral indignation and sponsors playfulness. Morcillo's pictorial style contributes to this artifice. The objects and figures are finely painted in an exquisite academic style, almost achieving a sense of photographic reality. He does not, however, paint himself out of the picture. His brushwork is visible, the surface is painterly. The translucent blue lines painted around the figures are very characteristic of his personal style. These lines create an airy space around the figures, reinforcing their three-dimensionality, while also adding a sense of artifice. The artist is earnest in his artistic undertaking, and therefore these scenes, as outlandish as they might seem, are not trivial. Paraphrasing Sontag's points on camp, Morcillo's painting proposes itself seriously, while at the same time it is too much, it is over the top. In these two paintings, the same models are used. In the one on the right, they have been given a hairy chest, reinforcing their maleness, which contrasts with the feminizing elements in the painting, the flowing robes, turbans, flowers, and so on. The phallic flute held to the mouth and the teasing smiles all stimulate one's imagination. Morcillo's swooning figures contrast with the portraits of the many non-smiling sitters he painted for the Spanish elite to earn a living, as you can see in the example on the left of the uniformed Spanish grandee. A comparison in terms of smiles can be drawn between Morcillo's figures and the laughing figures by the 17th century Dutch artist Frans Hals or Caravaggio's triumphant Eros. While Hals' pictures are based on observation, of real life and Caravaggio's on mythology, Morcillo conjures up a sensual world that is thinly veiled as medieval Granada. In his pictorial space, young men and also women at times can be uninhibited, like children, joyful, teasing, witty, sometimes moody and languid, always in control and at ease in their bodies. And occasionally, as you can see here, he introduces a female figure, creating a ménage à trois. In this painting, Morcillo alludes to bondage. No smiles here. 3 nude figures standing and sitting on a stepped platform are identified as slaves by the Arabic writing on the back. Flowing drapery has been arranged to cover their genitals, while the shells in the foreground are suggestive of their draped genitals. The figures' postures, expressions, and props allude to their roles in the sexual games they are ready to offer. On the right, the figure's core expression, his hands held together, signals submission. The tall central figure, clutching a rope around his neck, gazes smugly at the viewer. The broad-shouldered youth on the left flaunts his bare chest, while his downcast gaze and the soft velvet cap adorned with a flower give him an effeminate air. The stage picture suggests a fictitious male brothel, which demands to be compared with the many depictions of female prostitutes in modern painting. In fact, it comes across as an ironic counterpoint to the Africanized figures in Demoiselle d'Avignon, the most famous of all brothel scenes in art by Morcillo's countryman Picasso, first exhibited in 1916 and deemed immoral. Morcillo did not believe in Picasso's modernism and said so publicly, and I quote, "Modernism lacks deep emotion, it's not worth it. Beethoven, Chopin, yes, this is the truth, and in painting it has to be the same." Yet, despite their differences, both Picasso and Morcillo forced the viewer to reconsider the relationship between societal norms and real experience, fear and shame. It might seem odd to you to bring these works together, but one of my central concerns in my research is to unsettle the standard narrative of modernist experimentation. Academic art was just as prevalent and had the potential to disrupt, to unsettle societal norms. As another point of comparison, Morcillo's work resonates to some extent with the ethno-pornographic photographs of Sicilian youth taken by the German photographer Wilhelm von Glöden in Taormina. They pose nude in the open air with wreaths, amphoria, jewelry, and turbans. In comparison, I would say that Morcillo's models seem to be imbued with a greater sense of awareness, suggesting complicity with the artist, with the onlooker, engaging the viewer in their mood. A pertinent comparison are the photographs of the ballet russe, who performed in the Alhambra in 1918 and posed for these photographs. They are androgynous, theatrical, frivolous, exotic, almost excessive in the signification of their hedonism, possessing, as it might be asserted, all the markers of camp. The ballet russe were a direct inspiration for Morcillo's pictures of young men who, like the dancers, are in control of their performance, in their own world and in control of each other. The scholar Roberta Privitera, one of the few who has written about Morcillo, applies the Bakhtinian concept of the carnivalesque to Morcillo's works as a, and I quote, space in which it is possible to subvert and blow up, even only for a moment, the categories imposed by a restricted morality. In this painting, the sitter evokes a fissure between interior gender identity and the physical reality of living within a fixed gender position. The traditional physical attributes of masculinity, a strong neck, angular jaws, quite big nose, are combined with traditional female Spanish clothing. Is it a man dressed as a woman or a manly woman? The sitter is seen against the Albaicin quarter, the oldest part of Granada associated with gypsy culture. But when we look closely, the background is a painted backdrop in the artist's studio. It is a picture within a picture. Everything is artifice. So Morcillo's manipulation of gender recalls Judith Butler's assertion that drag is a radical position. It is the way in which genders are appropriated, and that all gendering is a kind of impersonation or approximation. Morcillo's painting is queer art, serving to expose the fixed nature of sexual identity as a fantasy, to trouble, to break up or rupture the visual field before our eyes. The enigmatic sitter is, in fact, his wife, who is seen here in the center in an informal family photograph, Morcillo on the right and their daughter on the left. If Morcillo's work disturbs traditional constructs of gender and sexuality, how was his work received? How did Spanish society and the law view gay and transgender people? Sodomy was decriminalized in Spain between 1922 and 1928, then recriminalized briefly, only to be decriminalized again under the Second Spanish Republic. Scientists defined same-sex desire as a pathological problem that could be cured. It was the object of satirical illustration and moralizing critique. Yet, according to historians of sexuality in Spain, while being gay was morally condemned, by 1930, homosexuality was visible and identifiable in a way not possible just 30 years before. It also found increasing expression in literature. Spanish authors wrote Orientalist novels in which homoeroticism is central, and an example is Augusto Dalmar's novel about a Basque priest who travels from northern Spain to Seville and falls in love with an Arab-looking boy, but can't be honest with himself. As in Morcillo's work, the justification for same-sex love is based on the notion of Arab culture being more permissive. Gayness is also addressed in non-Orientalist popular novels. Antonio de Hoyos associated homosexuality with a morbid decadence, low-class life, and therefore a form of dissidence. In contrast, Álvaro Retana constructed a more frivolous form of homoeroticism in his fictitious accounts, in which young working-class men are the object of desire, and as Joe Labani notes, they are marked by a camp theatricality, which is mirrored by Retana's own involvement in cabaret as songwriter and costume and set designer. Both Retana and De Hoyo fashioned a camp image of themselves, dressing flamboyantly, similar to the fin de siècle decadent dandy, especially Retana, who declared himself to be the most beautiful man in the world. And here we see him, perhaps this is him, it's a portrait of a man cross-dressing. Morcillo, by contrast, cultivated an excessively modest image, even one of self-deprecation, and he was seemed to be quite a private person. Morcillo's work featured also in major articles in art magazines and newspapers from the mid-1920s onwards. And the journalists invariably present him as a humble artist who says he enjoys living in Granada, surrounded by only a few things, without social aspirations, and very little interest in selling his work. He's seen as an Oriental painter-poet with a special sensibility. He is, they say, someone who weaves dreams in silk and gold, has a vast imagination. None of the critics engage explicitly with the homoerotic subject matter of his work. Only in certain passages, for those in the know, is it possible to discern allusions to Morcillo's interest in homoeroticism and his own sexuality. An article titled Gabriel Morcillo, the painter who wants to know, draws attention to his sensual lips, thus ascribing an erotic undertone to the persona of the artist. Further, this writer speculates whether Morcillo had a restless adolescence and may have lived in painful solitude, which then stimulated his interest in painting. And this writer also identifies in Morcillo a deep anxiety of an artist who seeks to uncover some kind of truth. At one point, he hints at a contradiction between Morcillo's heterosexual life and his painting, when stating that the artist finds himself in pain in the violent contrast between his allegories and real life. The consensus amongst all critics is that Morcillo is a great painter who develops the academic tradition of painting, observing correct and expressive drawing, well-modeled forms, soft colors, and balanced compositions. And on such grounds, it was perfectly possible to select Morcillo's homoerotic paintings for show at the Venice Biennale in 1928. Morcillo also had an influence on his pupils and other artists, such as Francisco Soria Aedo and José Suárez Peregrín, today completely unknown, but they exhibited their work in the National Exhibition in Madrid. The acrobats on the right present a provocative image in that it accentuates the muscular body of a female figure, challenging the traditional ideal of feminine beauty. However, Morcillo's pupils in Granada received mixed reviews, and rightly so, if we are looking at the example on the top of the slide. Lorca dismissed this as bad art. Already in 1928, Lorca wrote that young painters who followed Morcillo were on the wrong path. For him, it was Picasso whose modernism should be followed. Art, he stated, should be virile. At the same time, though, he valued Morcillo as an artist following a personal, independent path. It is good that Gabriel Morcillo paints what he wants to paint. There he is. There are his paintings. Arguably, Morcillo provided a space for Lorca and others to reimagine femininity and masculinity beyond societal norms. Living as a gay person became difficult after 1936. Lorca, as we know, was killed by Franco officers. Franco's regime condemned homosexuality and in 1954 prescribed internment of homosexuals in special labor camps. Teoyo, the author of homoerotic novels I mentioned earlier, was imprisoned in 1939 and died. Retana was imprisoned for several years, but he admitted to being gay and he survived. Morcillo never declared his sexual orientation openly. He lived in Granada for the rest of his life. He did not have so much trouble with the Franco regime. Here we see him at an opening of an exhibition of his in Granada in 1944. And in the other image you can see him painting a portrait of Franco himself. His work was valued by the regime. In 1947, a painting by Morcillo was used as a diplomatic gift on the occasion of Eva Perón's visit to Spain. Perhaps the gift signaled a false sense of liberalism. In 1942, 11 of Morcillo's paintings, such as the homoerotic slaves, were shown in Nazi Germany at the official exhibition of Spanish art at the Prussian Academy of Fine Art in Berlin in 1942. This exhibition was part of a cultural exchange program between Nazi Germany and Franco Spain during World War II. Within the Spanish context, the acceptance of Morcillo's work is not entirely surprising. We have to remember that Franco's regime entertained empathetic attitudes to the Arab world. Franco's rebellion had begun in northern Morocco in 1936 and involved the recruitment of Moroccan soldiers. And after his victory, Franco kept a Moroccan escort who was seen in official parades or ceremonies in Madrid. Franco early on sponsored the pilgrimage of Moroccan people to Mecca. The regime also trained and promoted Moroccan artists at official fine art exhibitions in Madrid to reinforce the colonial concept of a Spanish-Moroccan brotherhood. In this sense, Morcillo's paintings did not pose a threat to official Francoist ideology. In the German context, Morcillo's appeal is more difficult to understand, but the Nazis too had political ties to the Arab world at certain times, and the classical language of painting, the perfect white bodies, alone would be an excuse to admire these paintings for a Nazi officer. Goebbels is said to have bought a painting by Morcillo. Arguably, those viewers in the closet might find enjoyment in the oriental homoeroticism in Morcillo's paintings, despite outwardly expressing disdain for the figures represented in Morcillo's paintings. Meaning, as we know, lies in the eyes of the beholder. We, as postmodern viewers, find in his work an early critique of constructs of gender and sexuality, which foreshadows camp art and visual culture from the gender-fluid film Performance in 1970 to Mapplethorpe's self-portrait, to Almodovar and the Spanish movida in the 1980s. In his own time, though, Morcillo never declared his sexual orientation, and the implications of his art were never openly discussed. In our time, I think it is important to recognize artists like Morcillo for challenging the fixity of gender and sexuality long before the topic of gender fluidity entered mainstream culture. I leave you with one of Morcillo's smiles, the smile of a flamboyantly self-satisfied, beautiful young man, signifying knowledge of the secretive other world that Morcillo mentally inhabited, but possibly never lived in. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, for a really fascinating feast of the senses with your journey through Morcillo and the connections you're making. I'm going to leave it, though, to Dr. Naomi Lebens, who is the head of cultural services at Royal Holloway and part of Curator, to give the vote of thanks.
It's a pleasure and an honour to have been asked on behalf of the Centre for Visual Studies and all of us here at Royal Holloway to offer this vote of thanks to Professor Claudia Hopkins for travelling all the way from Edinburgh to be with us here this evening, and for sharing this really thought-provoking lecture, which for me, as I'm sure for many of us, was a most welcome introduction to the sparkling work of Gabriel Morcillo. As we're about to move on to the picture gallery for our reception, I wanted to take this opportunity to say that I'm going to certainly be inspired to reflect on the challenge and homoeroticism of Morcillo's work and the way his early 20th century subversion of depictions of gender and sexuality, which seems so striking to us today, and especially with the help of Professor Hopkins' eloquent exposition, were really hidden in plain view. Especially in those contexts of Nazi Germany and the Franco regime. It strikes me as powerful, this illustration of just how much or how little we often see of what's right in front of us, and of the inhibiting effects of the frames of reference and proclivities we as viewers bring to artworks. The Victorian establishment is certainly a deliberate and defining characteristic of our own collection here. The artists, unlike the refreshingly independent Morcillo, were all associated with the Royal Academy and the leading tastes, styles and subjects of the day. It confronts us as modern viewers with challenges and at times uncomfortable encounters with the dominant narratives of our country's past. But on closer exploration there too, sub-narratives are also apparent, and what meanings we can make of this collection today remains an open question. Particularly rich in Orientalist painting, I encourage you to hold on to Professor Hopkins' lecture and perhaps a glass of wine as you seek out scenes of opium dens and street scenes from Cairo and Tunis in the gallery. Of course, for 19th century British artists, Spain too was imbued with a sense of exoticism and discovery, which can be seen especially in the monumental Suppliants by Edwin Long, again offering quite a different approach to Morcillo in terms of subject and theme. I, for one, am very eager to continue this conversation in the gallery, and so I will ask you to join me now once again in offering our sincere thanks to Professor Hopkins for this fascinating lecture and being here with us this evening.